Welcome to Stanford Legal, where we look at the cases, questions, conflicts, and legal stories that affect us all every day. I'm Pam Carlin, along with Joe Bankman. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Pam.
So one of the things that's really striking about the internet is when the internet first came around, when Al Gore invented the internet, one of the things that internet companies wanted was just not to be regulated. The idea was the internet wants to be free, and one of the central pieces of law about the internet, the provision of what was called the Communications Decency Act, Section 230, essentially said that if you were simply the provider and not the speaker of things that were on your platform, that is, you were getting other people's speech and having that on your platform, you wouldn't be held responsible in the way that, for example, if you're the New York Times and you publish something that's false and defamatory, you can be sued. If you are other media companies, you can be regulated in various ways. And they really didn't want to be regulated. But all of a sudden, we're seeing a lot more requests by internet companies to regulate, stop me before I kill again.
That's right. And even before we have this latest somewhat bombshell announcement of Facebook that I'm going to mention, organizations like Facebook started a kind of self-regulation, having 18 standards, I believe, about regulating obscenity, regulating illegal activities, regulating hate speech. So they were doing self-regulation. And then some months ago, they said, hey, how about some help here?
Yeah, and there was this surprise announcement by Mark Zuckerberg that they needed some outside group to essentially help them make decisions about what should be taken down and what should be put back up.
And they started to outline what this outside group might be, just throwing out some ideas there. And of course, Facebook asks, Stanford Law School delivers, because we had a policy practicum and they've published a white paper, so to speak, and we're going to talk to representatives of our policy practicum on what that process might be to get some help to make these difficult decisions about content. And we're thrilled to have Nate Persily back with us. Nate is a James B. McClatchy, a professor of law. He's got appointments in political science in the Freeman Spogli Institute in communications. And regular listeners note that Nate's been on many times to help us understand many issues here.
He has been, and joining Nate will be Madeline Magnuson, who was a student in the policy practicum, who came to Stanford after a stint at the Rand Corporation and worked on the white paper.
And so, Nate, why don't you start us in on this? And let's start with that announcement. What was behind it? How do you interpret it? And what did that start in motion?
Well, a few months ago, Mark Zuckerberg in an interview talked about having a Facebook Supreme Court. And the idea was that the decisions that Facebook made about content on its platform should be appealable to some outside body. In the same way that the court might check the legislature, maybe there would be some other body that would check Facebook's power when it came to its decisions under its community standards. That is easier said than done. But a team of people at Facebook then have been working for much of the last year to try to put together this outside board, which is now called the Content Review Board, or at least that's the name of the day, to try and create a global body that will be responsible for hearing appeals from some content decisions that they make really anywhere around the world.
So who brings the appeals? Because in a regular court system, there's a winner and a loser. You start off with a plaintiff and a defendant. You end up with a winner and a loser at the trial stage. And then whichever party, or sometimes both parties, that doesn't like the result appeals it. How does that model map onto what Facebook's talking about? Is it people who had something taken down bring an appeal? Is it people who would like to have something taken down that wasn't taken down bring appeal? Is it Facebook seeking advisory opinions? Who goes to this?
Well,
this body?
that is all to be determined. That's one of the types of things that we were trying to investigate with this policy practicum, because you could think of many different models. And so while the Supreme Court model was the one that kind of came out of the early discussions, you could think of this more like an agency model, where you could have petitions for rulemaking or something like that, or as an ombudsman or a special master. So there's all kinds of ways. Once you start thinking about an outside body that's going to do oversight of Facebook, there are all kinds of different models. But as you suggested, at a minimum, it's going to be people whose speech has been taken down from the platform that then would appeal to the outside body to have it reinstated. It might also be people who wanted speech taken down and asked Facebook to take it down, and then Facebook refused. Or it could be situations in which Facebook passes the buck to this outside group to then, the outside court or content review board to then make a decision that would take Facebook's sort of feet out of the fire.
So how many things does Facebook take down in an average day? It's a huge number, isn't it?
It depends what you're looking at. More than 1 million pieces of content are taken down per day. That is actually a low end of the sort of spectrum because they take down close to 1 billion accounts a month through, not a month, a quarter, through automated filtering. So it depends whether you talk about the stuff that those individuals who are clicking, sort of evaluating content, these content moderators, where they make 6-second determinations about taking stuff down, whether it's obscenity or whether it violates other community standards, or just the stuff that the filters prevent from coming up.
And, if you think about, like in California, how many judges it takes just to hear appeals in the California system, which is the largest court system in the world, you're talking about a massive undertaking here.
Potentially. I don't think that they realize how much they bit off when they decided to go down this road. That's actually one of the things that's come out of our interaction with them through the policy lab is that the students in particular want Facebook to really be bold in thinking about a large court, a large oversight body.
Yeah, because it's like that thing from Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. I mean, if you create a system in which people have the right to say, no, put my thing back up there, if you don't impose some costs on them, why not ask to put your stuff back up there?
Well, that's right. And you can see how this could be sort of ripe for gamesmanship where different types of groups would try to manipulate the board. But whether this board is symbolic in a bad sense or a good sense, we don't know. I mean, it could be, again, just some kind of sop that's paid by Facebook in order to placate those who criticize it. But it could also be, symbolic in a good sense, which is that some of the most contentious decisions that they make could be outsourced to this outside board.
This is Stanford Legal. And today we're talking with Nate Persley and Madeline Magnuson about the new content review board at Facebook.
And as we were talking, Mandy, I noticed you almost were about to jump in. I want to give you an opportunity. What?
That Mandy is called Madeline.
Madeline. I said Mandy. I want to give you an opportunity if there's a comment that you want to throw in.
Sure. So I wanted to give some numbers to ground our discussion of the scale at play here. Based on the most recently released numbers by Facebook from the first quarter of 2019, there's about 624 million pieces of content removed per month, whether content that was flagged by individual users or by the algorithm, and that's actually that's only 24 million. Only 24 million of those are non-spam related pieces of content, and then that generates about 8 million total appeals in Facebook's internal appeals system. So there's already somewhat of a system in place to provide some internal friction and initial error correction.
And so the idea of this would be on top of that internal appeal?
Yes. What the practicum is recommending to Facebook is that anyone who has the opportunity to appeal to Facebook internally has to sort of exhaust that appeals process before petitioning the board.
And the practicum then has to think of a way to filter a potential 8 million appeals because it'd be undoable. And so part of the practicum, as I understand it, is hearing this, looking at this complicated part of the world and figuring out how would we design a system that would meet some needs and get at least some of the more important appeals heard. And how did you do that? How did you approach this task?
So we envisioned a sort of two-tiered system where first you have full-time staff whose job it is to essentially do cert review, where you're going through the millions of petitions to try to figure out which are the more interesting cases and which ones should be prioritized. But in order to make that effective, because at the scale we're talking about, you'd have to get through an insane number of cases per hour. One estimate we made would that if you had 60 people working on this full time, it would be 128 cases per person per hour to go through. If you had 400 people, then it would get down to 21 cases per hour, which is where at these numbers it starts to sound like, oh, that's reasonable. But even for that to make sense, Facebook would really need to give these case selectors access to a lot of metrics so that they can meaningfully sort and prioritize their attention on even the question of which cases to refer to the board
from
for
your
review.
perspective, what kinds of cases do you think ought to be going to this content review board?
So we kind of approached that from two different angles. The first was what kind of criteria, and we think what kind of criteria should the selectors apply? And we think that first, they should prioritize cases of essentially first impression, where there's a significant undecided issue that affects a large number of people or has a severe
Undecided by
impact.
whom?
Undecided by Facebook's community standards, which is essentially their statutory law.
So it's cases where it's not clear whether something falls inside or outside the community standard.
Exactly.
And why is that something that should go to an outside body rather than just to Facebook itself?
So Facebook's content moderators are constantly applying this sort of discretion on a content by content piece, but there are times where Facebook standards are unclear or conflicting. And
Could you give our listeners a kind of concrete example of a place where the content standards are sufficiently unclear that really the outside body ought to decide, is this inside or outside?
Let me give a really contemporary case, which is this case of the altered video of Nancy Pelosi, right, which happened last week, that there's a question as to whether that applies, could be taken down under various community standards. Facebook has decided, no, it's not. This question of so-called deep fakes, that was a shallow fake because it was kind of an easy manipulated video, but that is going to be a big issue in the coming years. And so to have some standards that are, some guidelines that are decided by an outside body would be quite important right now.
So is that I guess I'm trying to figure out whether that's come up with a new guideline that says deep fakes come down versus deciding whether something is or isn't a deep fake. And it would seem to me that one of those things is the kind of things appellate bodies normally do. The other of those strikes me as legislative. So, here on Stanford Legal, we're talking with Nate Persley and Madeline Magnuson about this. What's your reaction?
Well, that is in some ways the $1 million question, and why the metaphor.
Can I get the million?
Yeah, well, that's Mark Zuckerberg. But
and for him, $1 million is like when I give a dime to a panhandler.
But that's one of the reasons why the metaphor of the Supreme Court doesn't work here, because this, Facebook doesn't really have to pay attention to what this board said in the end, but. There is the possibility, and I think we recommend this, that not only will this board be deciding concrete cases, but it will be recommending changes to the community standards. Now, there was the way we organized this practicum is that there was one group of students that did with membership, one that dealt with appeals processes and case selection, another that dealt with the procedures of the court, and the final was enforcement of the court's decisions. We had different professors on each one of those. But this question as to sort of what is it that the court is going to do in the end in terms of its impact on the community standards is a really important one. And, the students recommended that they should be able to make recommendations for alterations to the community standards. It's very different than what you might think the U.S. Supreme Court would be doing. So it is a kind of hybrid model of an agency or a court.
What did the role that Facebook played in this? Because I know it's not like you just went by yourself and learned things about Facebook. You worked with them, or they came in. Do you have a sense of how they heard this? I mean, this sounds perfectly plausible. To a lot of our listeners, they wouldn't know about that distinction anyway. It's perfectly plausible that it would help them with standards. Are they okay with that?
So let me talk a little bit of how this emerged, which is that Paul Brest, our former dean and current professor at Stanford Law School, and Rob Reich, who's a professor of political science here at Stanford, all three of us were invited to Facebook, along with a lot of sort of judges, academics, some others, to do a simulation as to what this content review board might do. And we emerged from that, and Paul Brest said, why don't we do a policy practicum on this? Because Facebook is not only sort of asking Stanford to weigh in, they've put out a public announcement saying, look, we want ideas about how this content review board is going to work. And so we figured, all right, this would be a great opportunity for students who are interested in these questions to come in work on this. Now, what did make us a little bit special from the average person that's allowing, that's offering ideas to Facebook, and they do that through an internet portal, is that since we're here in Silicon Valley, we had the opportunity to interact with them. Maybe I'll turn it over to Madeline. You can talk a little bit about the interactions that we had with the Facebook folks.
Yeah, folks from Facebook came and spoke to the class the first week. The second week, we got to go and see what a content standards forum looks like, which is essentially where they consider changes to the community standards, and as well as go and present our recommendations in person.
So one question is why Facebook wants to outsource this of all of the things they do. What's your sense of, is that so that they can sort of wash their hands of it and say, it's not us taking your thing down, ultimately it's this board, or it's not us leaving these things up, it's this independent group?
So I think it's a combination. Facebook would say that it's about having a more legitimate body make these decisions.
And what makes it legitimate is these people don't make money one way or the other off whether content's taken down or up, and Facebook does. Is that what's driving this?
That's crucial, as well as the concern that the people making these ultimate calls be representative of the entire globe.
And by representative of the entire globe, what do you mean?
You want to talk about our membership?
No,
team?
go. I mean, this is all right. So you've gotten $1 million for your first question. This is your second $1 million question, which is like, as you start to unpack that question, like how would you make a body, some kind of oversight board that is representative of the entire, 2 billion Facebook users? It's a very challenging
And how many
question.
of the people on the board would be bots?
Well, and how big does the board have to be, right? Because Facebook has come out and they said that they decided that it would be 40 people. And you start saying 40 people.
You're not going to have 40 people all deciding a single case,
no,
right? They're going to sit in panels. And
that's right.
So the question of uniformity, I guess, is one of the things that perhaps we can explore when we come back, because we'll be back with more from our guests, Madeline Magnuson and Nate Pursley, in just a moment here on Stanford Legal on Sirius XM Insight 121. Welcome back to Stanford Legal, where we look at the cases, questions, conflicts, and legal stories that affect us all every day. I'm Pam Carlin, along with Joe Bankman.
Nate, before we took a break, we briefly asked you who's going to hear these cases. And Facebook has billions of users. Talk to us. Your report talked about this in great detail. Can you give us a flavor of the questions you looked at?
When you start to unpack this question as to how you develop a representative oversight board for Facebook, you realize how complicated it's going to be. Because as you said, they have over 2 billion users on Facebook, let alone the additional platforms of Instagram and WhatsApp, which might be roped in by this. And, to think about 40 people, which is what they have in mind, being on this Facebook Supreme Court or Content Review Board.
And this would be their full-time job.
Well, that originally the way Facebook envisions it is going to be part-time. And so if you start dealing with the numbers of cases that potentially they're going to deal with that Madeline talked about before, it's very hard to see how you could get sort of the right group of people that would just be 40 people that we'd be dealing with a substantial share of the Facebook appeals. Now, that's why it may end up being that they're dealing with symbolic cases, right? The most controversial cases are the ones that are most incendiary. But, roughly 10 to 15% of Facebook users are from India. Does that mean you should have 4 or 5 Indians on this 40-member board? Suppose you take one person from the UK. Suppose that person was in favor or against Brexit. Like, do you have to make sure that you have political representation from different areas, let alone issues of religious, racial, gender diversity?
So walk me through that. That's a different metaphor than any of the metaphors we've been talking about so far. That's more like a jury, that you want a fair cross-section. Is that really what we want, or do we want people who are sensitive to issues of free expression, who care about mass media and the like, versus, 40, let's say, randomly picked users of Facebook doing this part-time?
I think that you need both. For this to have legitimacy, they are going to have to be somewhat representative of the Facebook user population. I can say this sort of personally, since I've sort of started the other outside group that does some kind of oversight of Facebook, this group called Social Science One, which is trying to make Facebook data available to scholars, that unless you have significant representation from other parts of the world, it's going to be seen as mainly a U.S. Body that's trying to regulate a U.S. company.
But should these be people who have some prior experience with free expression in some way? Or is it, what do you see the application process looking like for people? Or is Facebook going to do something like, secret societies where they go and tap 40
They'll have an algorithm, and they already know the right people.
Well, the answer is it's got to be diverse, both as to expertise as well as other kinds of backgrounds, so that you want engineers on there. You want people who are experienced in free expression. You want to make sure that you have age diversity, right? One of the interesting questions they're dealing with is trying to look. This is mainly a platform that's used by somewhat, at least Instagram is used by younger folks. And so I think that they want to shoot for all of that, that on this 40-member board you want representation from all around the world, so it has a jury component to it, but it also has diverse expertise.
And our report recommended that some proportion, maybe 20% of the board members, be selected through some sort of community nomination process to sort of open it up and make it a little bit more of the common man jury version.
What would that mean in terms of community representation with billions of users?
Yeah, it's a thorny issue.
Well,
as well as trying to weed out sort of zealots who are pushing a particular policy agenda.
And they would sit in panels of 3 to 5?
Our procedures team was planning on panels of 3 with the potential for an on-bank review by 9 in some cases.
Yeah, so the chances of actually getting a representative decision maker on any given case are pretty small then.
Yeah, and one consideration there is do you make sure you have our procedures team essentially said that for every case you should decide what 8 sub-regions of the world it came from and make sure that at least one of the 3 judges was from that region. But no more than 2 were from that region, so that you have some diversity of thought going into it.
This is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking about the Content Oversight Board process at Facebook. Joe?
One thing that struck me as I read your document, which is so thorough, is the average person might get very frustrated in that because it's so much a legal document in terms of procedure. The average person wants to know, do we take down the Pelosi video or not? And what you've spent an enormous amount of effort just starting the procedures for is to decide what are the procedures, really, to even come up with procedures for deciding questions like that. Are there parts of your procedures that we haven't covered? We only have a few minutes left that you'd like to go over.
There's one issue I'd like to address, which is the issue of independence from Facebook. We've kind of discussed this. In some ways, this is self-regulation, but it's also trying to set up a body that can be an independent oversight. And it's very important in terms of selecting those members and controlling the budget and purse strings, as well as making amendments to the structure of the board, that Facebook not be able to act unilaterally.
Yeah, so one of the famous but totally apocryphal stories about the U.S. Supreme Court involves a case where the Supreme Court told the state of Georgia that it couldn't take land away from a particular Indian tribe. And after the case was decided by the Supreme Court, somebody asked President Jackson, who was very much in favor of taking land away from the Indians, what he thought of it. He said, the Supreme Court's made its decision, now let them enforce it. The international version of this, because as you say, we need to think global, is Stalin saying, how many divisions does the Pope have? And so I wonder, at the end of the day, what other than potential commercial pressure is going to lead Facebook to take down things that it thinks makes money for it? What's going to be the force of the board, do you think?
Well, I think the reputation of the people who serve on it is going to be pretty important here.
So all of these things will be published, so everybody will know.
That's the idea.
Yeah,
but also that, as you said earlier, it's not clear that Facebook is necessarily looking at this as a check on their decision so much as it might be offloading some of the hard questions to it. And so they might be more than willing to make these decisions. Frankly, most of the questions...
So that's like the Waylon Jennings song, the devil made me do it. The first time the devil made me do it, the second time I did it on my own.
Maybe. Your knowledge of country western music is better than mine. But
probably not.
But they, most of the decisions, whether it's about obscenity or whether it's about like these deep fakes or hate speech and the like, most of it's not motivated actually by financial reasons. They just want to figure out what's an answer that they can operationalize on the platform.
I took this opportunity not only to read your report, but the community standards that Facebook has. And when you read them, I do think it goes against the notion this is simply about money. I mean, for example, there's no pornography on their site, and they actually go quite a ways past that point, maybe too far past the point. But that's clearly not, in the short term, the profit maximizing position to have. It has something to do about kind of legitimacy and long-term acceptance, I'm guessing.
That's right. And also trying to develop a global platform that's going to be responsive to these controversies around the world. I should say in my First Amendment class this term, for the first time, not only did I teach the constitutional doctrine, but I also taught the Facebook community standards so that people could see the different ways that a company is dealing with these issues.
And what do you think is the hardest question that the Oversight Board's likely to face?
You want to try? No.
The hardest.
Well, the hardest question, I think, is going to be in areas where people's lives are at stake. Because while we here in the U.S., when we think of the contemporary controversies, we principally are thinking of, say, election interference. In much of the world, the question is whether to leave up speech that's leading to riots or leading to some kind of ethnic violence.
Well, we've been listening to Nate Persily and Madeline Magnuson talk to us about a really heroic, great effort you've made to try to give Facebook some guidance on content moderation. And we'll have to see how it all works out, I suppose.
So thank you so much, Nate and Madeline, for joining us. And thanks to our listeners for joining us on Stanford Legal here on Sirius XM Insight 121.